See you.
Hello and welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. Today I've got my good buddy Julze Serendipity, who is the founder of Teelixer. Join me. He's also one of my favourite foraging freaks and cosmic weirdos. And we're going to talk about his company, a bunch of things related to medicinal mushrooms and anything, any other tangents that we go on today. So we had a crack at this last week, except I forgot to press record, and so we chatted for an hour and a half, and we covered some good material, and luckily we took some notes. So we're going to cover some of that stuff again. I've got some tea and superfood smoothie. We're ready to bang it out. And how are you doing, brother?
Yeah, good, man. Yeah.
Sweet. Awesome.
Okay, but yeah, got there in the end.
Cool. Again, tell us about Teelixer. Give us an intro to your company and what it's all about.
Okay, well, I started, as you know, as pretty much a cooperative. When you and I went and did the template in Bali, I actually funded it using fulvic acid, which was sort of my first product. And I still sell fulvic acid to this day for the reason that it's so good. But that sort of like went on to me doing a niche program and basically starting up Serendipity Superfoods, which was primarily like out of the back of my car and like at market stalls and things like that. And then I met Dan through bizarre serendipity, who just walked into my tent at St Andrews and was all excited by the allness and the fact that I had medicinal mushrooms, which was something that at the point of when I sort of entered into it, very, very few people were doing it. So, yeah, and it was weird because he actually lives in California and still does to this day. But he lives around the corner from St Andrews, relatively sort of Eltham way, and he just happened to be on tour and was there with his girlfriend at the time. And, yeah, and I mean, it took some time before Teelixer actually formed. Teelixer really came out of the building of our product Primal Essence, which is like a Jing-based formula, because we were both very, very depleted back then for various reasons. He'd done like a stupid amount of traveling, and I'd been like a very, very long-term vegetarian at the time, which didn't suit me at that particular juncture. Yeah, that's pretty much how it started, but it didn't happen until about 2 years after our initial meeting. As I said, I saw him once again at a night market a year later, and then myself and Sharon, who you know, started up this juice bar, which is still running to this day, called Home in the Docklands in Melbourne. And yeah, that's like out of that sort of exploded what would ultimately become Teelixer, even though it didn't sort of form until another, I think it was like the year after like I departed from Home. So it was like 2015 was when we found the right mushrooms that we wanted to work with. We kind of got a distributor on board. It was still Serendipity Superfoods at that point. So really in 2016 was like when the company genuinely formed. But Dan had actually created, actually I should tell you about that. I didn't say that last time. The way the labels came about, and you'll dig this, but I will have to go get another prop for this, and it's worth it. Trust me on this one.
All right. So for anyone listening to this, Julze and I used to hang out a lot when I was in Melbourne, and yeah, he was really quite an inspiration to me in terms of his nutritional knowledge. And yeah, we hung out a lot and made lots of smoothies together and got high on different superfoods and herbs. And yeah, he taught me a lot about Taoist practices and the use of medicinal herbs, Chinese medicines, which we're going to talk about more today because he has grown a company out of it since then.
But first of all, we're going to
what are we going to talk about? Sorry?
True. Believe it or not. So what happened is because like I actually put behind my logo originally for Serendipity Superfoods, a flower of life, because as you know, like we went through like a long period of like being associated with geometrical ceremonies and things like that. Anyway, it was a really surreal day that that was like the day before this was birthed, or really the time that it was birthed. So when I was doing my mushroom dieta, which was a self-imposed, primarily microdose, working with psilocybin, and then 2 ceremonies within. During the first ceremony, which was 1 week into this 2-week dieta, I'd been picking wild cordyceps, which I'll go into a little bit later on because I want to focus mostly on this thing. Mm-hmm. I'd been picking them incorrectly, like we were just digging them up out of the ground. Mm-hmm. And the way that I actually found them was quite interesting, but as I said, I'll go back to that later on. Anyway, during this particular journey, I actually started to turn into a cordyceps, or I felt like a cordyceps was sort of coming out of my head, but I was also told off by the cordyceps for not picking them correctly. And it was a friend who later on figured out how to pick them, which I'll explain later. Yeah. But anyway, so during that particular point of time, Dan over in California had a dream that he was visited that same night by a cordyceps man. Right, so that was kind of like the first synchronicity that like started to kind of knit together what would become the foundation of Teelixer. But after that, I had this particular day where my son was down with his mother and she stayed over, and we had to go to a Chinese doctor the next day because he was having difficulty sleeping or whatever, and we were supposed to go to his auntie's university graduation, and that didn't happen. And for some reason, something kind of snapped in me. And when we later on discuss the elemental natures of these mushrooms, you can really see why cordyceps is fire, because without airing too much dirty laundry, something kind of like it snapped in me. And I just made this decision, well, if we weren't going to go to Jasper's auntie's graduation, then I was sort of going to like drive home however I felt like, and I just felt compelled to do this, like so I'm trying to like say this in a way that makes it not too personal. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I drove to my friend Rosie's who wanted to see Jasper, and then I went to this op shop, which I now kind of call my sacred op shop, and I could go and pull more props, but I don't think it's really relevant. Like, I basically went into this op shop and I was going through these New Scientist or something magazines, and something told me that there had to be one about mushrooms, and I pulled this one out that was basically to do with Paul Stamets and like basically how mushrooms can save the world. I also got this jar which I later on put chunks of chaga in that's shaped like a mushroom. And then in the food section, because I was always looking for, and you'll love this one, like I was always looking for mushroom books, I found Food of the Gods by, I think it's Terence McKenna.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I literally got this copy of Food of the Gods. So there was like this incredible nexus that was happening that day for me at this particular op shop. And then I drove home, long story short, and that night, because I was slightly irritated, my friend who I was living with, Ed, was like sitting there talking to Jasper's mum, and I was sort of like buried deep in a copy of Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets, and I was just looking at all these bits, and it was talking about how you could put a spore print of mushroom species onto your hat or your clothing and walk around in like large sort of areas, and it would actually spread those spores specifically. Dan had actually gone silent because I had, at that particular point in time, he had less time, I guess, and patience for my more out there methodologies of running a company. I think he was really busy in trying to hustle and build, and also, I guess, prove himself, like in terms of being worthy and why it would be that I would kind of like start a new company when I already kind of had one. And so we went down and I showed him the cordyceps fields. And then we went and visited someone who I was trying to encourage to grow medicinal mushrooms. And I remember getting really angry and remembering that energy of fire is very much to do with anger. And there was a lot of that for me. And, oh, no, actually, I should tell you the other bit. There was actually another bit to that. Sorry. So with Cordyceps gunnii, or really any kind of wild mushroom, it can have if you don't cook it, it can, and then maybe there's some other mycotoxins present, it can have a slightly toxic effect. But for whatever reason, I was needed to go through this very significant shamanic experience. And I know that it was significant to me because my brother had visited that day. We'd made up, because we were getting these wild cordyceps. I should show you what they are.
Can I just ask a question too? Like, because I just want to, you know, for anybody that's listening, play the role of beginner's mind. We're going to be talking a lot about these medicinal mushrooms during this chat.
Yeah, for sure. And
I just,
sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted you to explain what cordyceps are for anyone who might not have an understanding of that.
So this is a cordyceps mushroom. This is a wild cordyceps, which is the Cordyceps gunnii. And the Cordyceps gunnii is basically native to Australia, but it's very, very similar to its counterpart that you find, which is much smaller, called Cordyceps sinensis. And that's the one that you find in Nepal, in Tibet, and areas like that. It's much, much harder to find. And to be fair, in 2015, that we had rain solid for like 30 days straight. So it was a gangbuster mushroom season. But you can see that it's basically a grub of an insect, the ghost gum moth in this case. And so you don't actually see this full thing. So it's a unique mushroom. No other mushrooms like this in the world. So it grows off the bodies of various insects, which it mummifies in order to protect environments. And in the case of the Cordyceps gunnii, it actually grows out of and underneath one of the most DMT-rich plants on Earth, which I kind of propose sort of allows us to see that DMT, right, is not just for human consumption. It's something that actually is required for the environment on some level that's got an X factor beyond anything we can understand. But anyway, so if you can imagine that my hand is the ground, right, this would actually be below that ground, and this would be the only thing that's sticking up, which is the club head of it, that black sort of club head of it. And so in order to transform something from a living creature into something that's like a completely different creature, this is almost like a harmony or a hybridization between an insect and a mushroom. It requires the energy of fire, and that's why I was identifying that. But I'll go back into that because I just realized that we've now dovetailed into the story I haven't yet to tell you. So we were getting these and eating these raw. And I had a really big box of them, I think, that were dehydrated at the time. But I'd made a smoothie, right, where I blended up, I think it was like literally one of these. And my brother drank it. And I actually thought, surely he's not going to experience like the lung qualities of the cordyceps. Like, you know, he's just not that sensitive. But what was interesting is that the same night that I had my first experience of two, where I consumed them and felt, the best way to describe it is I call it like mushroom combo. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not exactly psychoactive, but it's not exactly not psychoactive. So I kind of feel like when you consume these, and there's a number of people who've now had this experience, and by the way, that doesn't mean these are unsafe. I've worked out how to use these safely, but because they're a chi herb, which I know I'll go into that later as well, when you have them in a raw state, they can be a little bit aggravating on, I think it's the gallbladder. I can't remember, but I actually spoke to a TCM practitioner as I started to unravel that. And if you want, I can literally go through the step-by-step process of this story because it involves quite a bit. But basically, what happened is I consumed it, and I was rolling a cigarette at the time, and I sort of turned around to Ed and I said, "Do you think it's okay that if I smoke when I'm around my son?" And I turned around into the kitchen, and as soon as I did, I drunk like quite a while ago, it was like there was a bubble of energy that opened up, and I suddenly realized I was in a totally different realm. And I went through this very unpleasant experience for about 3 hours, under the influence of this, and I came good. But Dan came over maybe a week later or something like that, and this would have been just prior to when I took him down to go mushroom hunting down the peninsula near Melbourne. And I said, look, I mean, we could get work done today. Like, this is a chi herb, man. This should like give us energy. What actually ended up happening is for 9 hours we were laid out. It was quite a cold day. We only had just enough energy to go and get like firewood to keep the fire going. And Dan had said nothing. He's unlike me. He's not a vocal person, so he really didn't say anything. I can't remember if I did either, but you sort of drift in and out of consciousness in this unpleasant, nauseous wave, I suppose. But the reason I'm telling that story is that going back to what I was saying about like me sitting there reading the book and looking at all these spores, I just got obsessed with the spore print. And anyway, Dan had gone silent, as I said, and generally when Dan goes silent, it means he's sort of up to something, like he's building something. And I was at market one day and he said, "Oh, what do you think of this?" And I was like, "Oh my God, it's amazing." Now, this is not the original packaging, but you can see that it's got the Vesica Pisces in it. All right, yeah. So I immediately went, "Oh my God, there's like this whole," and it's funny because remember how, and I'll talk about this later, but remember how I was talking about the red and the blue? Mm-hmm. Right, this is the very first thing that was ever designed. And I actually only realized the red and the blue thing last year. So I just wanted to show you that because obviously it funnels into like, the never-ending geometry of the world and things like that. But there was a few bizarre synchronicities that happened, i.e. that night when I turned into a cordyceps and Dan met this cordyceps man. And then the same night that I was going through this, like, it felt like a night of fire, like not a horrible fire, but I just made this decision, right, that I wasn't going to put up with a certain thing anymore. And also that I was going to, just sit there and read this book. And, oh no, actually it wasn't the book. I read bits out of the book, but some of it was that magazine that I found in the op shop. And it really spoke to me, the whole idea of how mushrooms could be used, in terms of like multiple purposes. What people sort of may not understand is that while, yes, medicinal mushrooms are great, and we can certainly talk more about that, there's also this other aspect where, you can actually use it to clean up environments. We can make textiles. There's a possibility that, like hemp, we could ultimately build houses and actually almost like an organic 3D printer, like print. There's like a guy making furniture with mycelium. So the applications for mycelium are vast, and that sort of opened up to me. And originally when we started Teelixer, even though we realized we were a medicinal mushroom company, we also had these broader goals down the track to do other things with it, which haven't actually eventuated because really you need to have a much deeper understanding of mycology on the levels in order to do that. Because, I mean, Paul Stamets has actually done some amazing work. He actually figured out how to remove ants, termites, any pests from an environment like about 100 meters, like spanning out from your home, just using a small agar dish with a particularly grown mycelium. So the applications for this are vast.
I presume it's raining there, yeah? Is that what I can hear?
No.
I can hear some sort of, like, weird noise, or is it crickets or something in the background?
No, I can hear that. I thought that was coming from you.
It's rather odd. Can you hear that noise?
Yeah, I can. Is that going to be annoying?
Well, it sort of appeared, and I'm hoping that it just disappears. But
wait, hang on. Hello. Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay.
And if you want, man, I can go into the broader story behind the cordyceps, all right? Because it actually involved other people. You've frozen now.
Yeah. Okay. A little bit of a technical issue. Hopefully that will resolve itself. You mentioned, the term TCM, which I asked you about the other day, which refers to traditional Chinese medicine. And I guess, again, for the purpose of educating anybody who might be listening to this, it'd be great if you could cover that concept in the Taoist philosophy of the three treasures, again, of the Jing, Shen, and Qi.
Yeah, for sure. So
it gives us a good foundation, like, to understand like what these mushrooms are doing to us and how to use them,
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I know I should have started with that. Like, I just realized that there's like all these broader things that I hadn't actually kind of touched on. But so in a nutshell, in TCM, which is traditional Chinese medicine, it's considered that you are given what's known as prenatal Jing, and they do work with the three treasures, but they work with it differently than the Taoists do. So you've got two types of Jing, right, which is your foundational essence, which I'll go into in a minute. But basically, you've got prenatal, which is kind of like your first and most important luck bucket or like energy storehouse that you're given, and then on top of that you can build postnatal Jing. And while TCM acknowledges that you can definitely build postnatal Jing, which is still something that requires a lot of effort and can be quite difficult, the Taoists believe that you can actually rebuild reserves of prenatal Jing. And so that's really the primary difference, and also that the Taoists, or at least Taoist tonic herbalism, doesn't work with all three classifications of herbs. So just to lay it out for you, there's the superior herbs, which are the tonic herbs, and the reason they're called superior herbs is because A, they nourish all the three treasures, or at least one treasure, but also they only work with these tonic herbs. They don't work with sorry, no, I realized I just got distracted. So the tonic herbs are like what you would use in daily practice. So generally when you go to a Chinese, even a Chinese grocer, but more similarly like when we were going to like actual Chinese herbal shops, a lot of the herbs that they have available are not anything but the superior herbs, because these are the sort of things that people are throwing into soups, cooking into food, and making a daily practice. And it's very kind of usual that they would do that in China. So the other classifications of herb on the other end of the scale are the inferior herbs, and that doesn't mean that they're inferior. It just means that really you need to have that TCM background in order to apply them. And the reason for that is, unlike the tonic herbs, they're not adaptogenic in function, so they're unidirectional rather than multidirectional. Then the middle classification is supportive herbs, and in some cases, like tonic herbalism will cross over into those supportive herbs, because they're kind of ones that you can't really take every day, or you might take them for a period of time, but they're a little bit aggressive, so they're not ones that, like, they can start to build up potential problems in the body if you keep doing that.
Can you just move your microphone slightly, bro, wherever that is on your computer? Because
I'm on a laptop.
Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, it just keeps making this noise, and often it seems to be in between when you're talking.
Yeah, I don't know. It's
Unless it's me.
Is it you?
No, I can't figure it out. Okay, it's not there at the moment. Now it is.
I can hear
it. You can't hear it?
I can hear it a little bit, yeah.
I'm just going to move my mic a little bit, see if that helps. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah. No, I've always been able to hear you. It's just that there's like that.
Okay,
yeah. So yeah. Anyway, so to go into tonic herbs is to basically work functionally within the body with what are called adaptogens. Now, adaptogens are a classification of herbs that, as I said, are multi-directional or rather dual directional. So a good example of it is reishi. So if you have reishi during the day, it's not going to make you fall asleep in the same way that if you have it at nighttime. But when you have it at nighttime, it will generally make you go into a much more rested state. When you have it during the day, because it's got qi qualities, it will basically work with that qi rather than that shen aspect, but it'll basically combine those two. And we'll go into the three treasures properly in a second. But just to give you an idea, they have these totally different aspects, even though they're the same herb. So over time, they educate the immune system to work and become more flexible and more functional through that adaptability. And there's not that many adaptogens in the world, but a lot of the tonic herbs are genuine adaptogens, cordyceps being one of them, reishi being another one, eleuthero is another one. But anyway, let's dive into like what the three treasures are. So the way that I explain the three treasures, the most easiest way to understand it is to use the candle analogy. And so I have three candles here with me. I've got like a tea light candle, and I've got like this beeswax candle, and I've got this much fatter candle. And so if you imagine that you have like two healthy specimens that come together to make a baby, you're more likely to get a candle like this. All right. However, if a couple of junkies come together, you're more likely to get a candle like this. So in other words, it's the combination of the two sets of chromosomes that will actually ultimately form the Jing. So this is, as I said, this foundational essence or this reservoir of energy. You need your Jing in order to actually activate your life. But the moment of birth, that candle is lit, and then basically you start burning it. And that energy is what is known as chi. And while you can develop chi in other ways, such as like yoga, meditation, putting good food into your body, not being so stressed, all that sort of thing, generally, like regardless, you're immediately activating a level of chi where you're burning some of that chi just by your birth. So in other words, it's kind of like you're given this incredible thing to start with, and you immediately start using it up. And while that sounds kind of entropic in nature, when we think about the actual outcome of that chi, which is the light that emanates from the candle, that's what's known as your Shen. So these are the three treasures. And the Shen is your spirit, your karma, your passion and excitement for life. And one of the big things that we see in this world today is that so many people are depleted of that lightness and that Shen. And the reason is not necessarily because they don't have a spiritual purpose, although in some cases that's the case. It's more likely that they're actually lacking this Jing. So if you've got this, like, you know, tiny little candle, you're really not going to feel like burning any of it, right? And you're just going to be like sitting there like on a low burning flame your whole life. And we've certainly met people who are like that. I mean, this is quite extreme. I don't believe anyone would actually receive Jing like this. But when we kind of look at these two candles and we see the difference, right, the logic behind it is if we light these candles, we already know before we light it which one's going to last longer. It's the one that's fatter and it's got like the longer wick. And even though this has got a longer wick, it's much thinner. So it's going to burn down quite quickly. So if you look at that as sort of your life, and like once that candle extinguishes, it's kind of game over, you can understand the nature of Jing. And it's interesting because Jing as a food source, like aside from the herbs, is generally things that are fatty in nature. So if you are a meat eater, it's meat. If you're a vegetarian, it's like nuts and seeds, but more particularly things like oils and fats like coconut oil and things like that. So basically the fatter the candle, right, the longer it's going to burn. And that's the main principle behind like where your Jing is at. Going back to the Taoist mentality versus the TCM mentality, let's imagine that you have a candle like this rather than a candle like this. You're more likely to be getting sicker earlier or have that sort of yellow canary kind of syndrome. To explain what a yellow canary is, it's those people who tend to feel the problems of the world before everyone else, and it's referring to the fact that back in the days they would actually take a canary, which has a significantly smaller lung capacity, down into the coal mines, and the moment that bird showed any distress or died, they knew that they had a limited amount of time to get out of that coal mine and survive, and it gave them that kind of window of opportunity. So when we see people around us, especially with the increase of like gluten intolerance, dairy intolerance, chemical intolerance such as MSG and other things like that, we're ultimately seeing like what's the future for us if we're not in that particular bracket. And this is where it kind of gets a little bit interesting, because if you're like that, you're going to feel that you don't have as many chips to play at the table. And as a result, you can either burn it up really quickly and get really sick and die, or you can realize that, which if you have enough intuition, and part of the thing is that the wisdom of these herbs teaches you that too, is to basically conserve what you've got and build on what you have. Whereas if you're more like this kind of person, this is the sort of person who parties hard, is usually really good at sports, has an incredible intellectual capacity, not necessarily, but they seem to have this ability to just smash themselves. And it's inherent that if you have Jing, because Jing is ultimately trying to create your expression of spirit, you're natively going to go out and do that because you know you can. The problem with that is that you don't actually know how long your candle is. And once that candle burns down to a certain point, and this is the problem for people who are like this, is they'll get to their 30s or their 40s or even their 50s, and because they haven't done anything other than smash their body, when it's time to repair, in some respects it's often too late. They've got a collection of junk and viruses and bacteria and all sorts of things in their body, and it's much more difficult for them to repair. So in some ways, being this candle is a huge advantage because you can take advantage of that and build on what you have. rather than, because I think when you're younger, you've got more plasticity of the mind to recognize where you need to change, whereas the older you get, that change becomes more and more difficult. So that's the main principles behind Jing and Qi and Shen. How
Yeah, that's great. And so, as you mentioned before, like some of these herbs are used to build those various three treasures. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what we actually ideally want to look for is a herb that nourishes at least one, if not more, of the treasures. So reishi is a three-treasure tonic, but it's really much more close to Shen. So we can understand that from its spiritual aspects. It's been, hailed in spiritual iconography and imperial iconography, especially in places like China. But it's really more of a spirit mushroom. And if you sort of translate that over to a Western understanding, it's a mushroom that alleviates stress. It's considered one of the ultimate anti-stress herbs. So when you take reishi, when you're in this hyper anxiety or a state of distress, it can just calm that down. Or if you're a meditator, you can take it and it will actually assist you to go deeper into that alpha mind state. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it also has qi qualities. I noticed when I originally made some reishi capsules up for my son, when he took it, he actually felt energized. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because when you're younger, you've got more of that jing and you've got more of that qi. So generally when you have jing already present, whenever you stack jing on top of that, it's going to almost immediately convert to qi. Right, and so therefore your Shen is going to express itself in a different fashion. But in the case of most people, especially as older people, they're just looking for a way to kind of get out of their problems. They've had a long time to be stressed, to be in jobs that they might not like, to be in relationships that are difficult, to have arguments with their boss, whatever it is. Right, it's stacked on so heavily that when you take it, you're definitely going to get that calming effect. But I really noticed that sort of qi quality of the reishi. I remember someone wrote to me once and said, "Oh, I really like your reishi. I've been smashing it on the basketball field ever since." And I'm like, wait, what? That doesn't really make sense to me. But now that I've understood it more deeply, I recognize that for certain people, that's how they're going to experience it. Mm. And that increased oxygen utilization that's present in reishi is going to pretty much give you an advantage on the athletic field anyway. So, and that's how that qi is kind of expressing itself, because qi and the lungs tend to be very related in that way.
I remember, when I lived in Melbourne, and it was one of the first real experiential experiences that I had with, feeling the effects of these herbs in making tonics. You had introduced me to, I think it was Truth Culkin's $1 million tonic drink or something that it was called at the time, and we used to brew that up and we'd have it, had about 9 of these herbs in it, and immediately, I would feel relaxed for about half an hour, or just energy go down, but then it would come online, and you'd feel re-energized from it. Or drinking it before bed, it would allow me to go drift into sleep, but then I'd wake up feeling more energized from it the next morning. And I think that's really the way we can talk about these things and explain them to people, but really getting them into your body and experiencing the effects of it is probably the best way,
Yeah, well, actually, you've raised a good point, because in the West, we have this mindset where if we're fatigued, we drink a coffee, or we have cacao, or in the pharmaceutical realm, we take a Codral when we're sick. And really, those daytime Codrals, they don't have any medicine in them. They've got speed in them. So they allow you to just push through, even though your body's telling you, rest, 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 you're sick, rest. And so say what was in that particular drink that we made, the primary herbs were reishi and astragalus. Asparagus root. And both of those are Shen tonics. Asparagus root is known as the Taoist flying tonic herb. So sometimes you experience flying dreams when you have it, as you're releasing things from your psyche. But either way, it's a very Shen herb, right? And reishi is primarily a Shen herb. So having those as the master herbs in that formula really does lend itself to its immediate effect at the beginning to basically make you feel really calm and kind of stoned. It's sort of like it just makes you feel like it's like a really, really strong chamomile, I guess. But some of the other herbs that are in there, I believe there was only one yang herb in there, which was the white Atracalotes, and that was because it was qi in nature. So that's going to build energy. But the Romania and the Hushu Wu in particular are very, very strong yin kidney tonics. And I'll explain what yin and yang is in this context. So yin basically is something that nourishes yin, and yang also nourishes yin. So it shows you that both of these things, while coming from a different place, are going to nourish that one point, which is rest and recuperation. So that feeling that you were getting was basically the response of your body allowing itself to rest, and it basically comes back better. And a way that I like to explain this is to talk about the nature of annual and perennial plants. So interestingly enough, the tonic herbs, with the exception of the cordyceps actually, are basically perennial, which means that like a tree, they go into rest state and growth state. So in the winter, right, as we all experience, especially if we're in colder areas, we sort of huddle around the fire. We're much more sluggish. We're more in that pensive state where we're going inward and like reflecting. Whereas when we're in that springtime and that summertime, we want to go out, we want to socialize, we want to interact. And that's the same way that you can look at a deciduous tree where it loses its leaves and kind of goes into a dormancy state in the wintertime. And then in the summertime and the springtime, it basically puts on new leaves and flowers, and you actually see new branches and stems growing as it like gets bigger, basically. And when we chop through like a tree, we can actually see the rings of growth of those years, and that really reflects that yin cycle and that yang cycle. So that yang bit is expressive and creative and expansive in nature, and that yin aspect is reflective, calming, and sort of going inward in nature. So when we can apply that to our life, instead of having a codral or whatever it is that kind of gets us through the day, the more that we can actually rest when our body tells us to, particularly working with these herbs, as you said, you can come out of that state feeling significantly more replenished as a result.
Mm. Yeah, I think, the other day we were talking about just how prevalent adrenal fatigue is in our society because of that, obviously it has to do with the economic model and people pushing to earn money and going against the wisdom of their body, denying that wisdom and needing to take stimulants and things that push them. But ultimately what goes up must come down, so much wiser to balance your energy systems out. You were talking the other day about this concept of the elemental nature of these was it the mushrooms in particular?
Yeah. So relatively early on, when I was sort of still running Serendipity Superfoods, my friend Ed came in, and he was and it's funny because I don't know if you know or your listeners know about a show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. Which I kind of see as like the upgraded Monkey Magic. And it was funny, I remember like Ed came in and he basically went immediately to the lion's mane. And it's funny because it wasn't the lion's mane quality that I had, because at that time we didn't know better, and we were bringing in mushrooms that were really, they didn't have the nutritional benefit of what we were looking for. And it's no surprise that I took chaga. I didn't take any of the other ones. I didn't even take reishi. I didn't understand reishi. It was only when I got proper extracts of these fruiting bodies that I really saw the power of them. But the chaga I had was actually half wild and half cultivated, so I at least kind of resonated with the chaga. So that was kind of my first love in the mushroom world anyway. But anyway, he was really drawn to these lion's mane, and I was like, I don't get it, man. Like chaga, take chaga. But for some reason, he was really dogged about this, and that's what he bought off me the very first time I met him. And then we became good friends, and he introduced me to the Avatar after I shamelessly introduced him to Monkey Magic, which the second season's really not that good, even though it's got a lot of really amazing kind of like sage comments in it and stuff. The Avatar is actually a really brilliant TV show in teaching kids, but even adults, about the elemental nature of all things, and I really like that. And I do understand that there's more different versions of the elements, but just for the purpose of this, we're dealing with air, fire, earth, and water as being like those primary elements. And it's interesting because in the following series of Avatar called Korra, it starts to deal in spiritual elements. So you can obviously see ether creeping in there. But anyway, so over a long course of time, I started to have different relationships to different mushrooms. I've already elucidated the one that I had with the cordyceps, which was really significant. And I'd already had this experience with chaga mushroom. And then I really fell in love with reishi and its benefit in terms of like calming everything down and making things just better, really. And so lion's mane was really like a last step for me. And I only realized, I had this meeting once with some friends, and I suddenly realized that it was the missing element. But before I get to that, I'll explain like sort of the elemental breakdown. So when you look at chaga, right, which I have a piece here, it's actually not a particularly good example. It kind of looks more like a mustache, right? They don't generally look like that. They're more like generally like a chunk. But this is a mushroom that grows on the birch tree primarily, up in northern and particularly Arctic regions. In fact, the more Arctic, the closer to the northern lights, they've found that the nutritional qualities of the mushroom is significantly better. So, for example, we get our chaga from Siberia, even though it's processed in China, and that's considered the world's best chaga. But that sort of blackened sort of look to it, and that sort of corky tan color, if you were to describe that as an element, Carl, how would you describe that? Like, of all the four elements, would you say that this is like fire or water or air or earth?
Earth.
Right, exactly. And it's significantly like earth. And I had this this client once basically say when her mother took the chaga, she felt like doing the haka. And I think when you think of the Māoris, right, of New Zealand, you can really see that earthy nature to them. Like, you know, they're heavy set, they're big, they're intimidating, and they embody what it is to be earth. And so a few clues like that started making me go, oh, there is an earthy nature to chaga. And when you look at the way that chaga reacts in the body, it gives you an energy, but not an energy like cordyceps. Cordyceps is much more intense and active from an athletic perspective, whereas this is more nourishing and building and sort of solidifying in terms of its energy. And, you know, it's no surprise that it's, you know, one of the highest antioxidant foods on the planet. So something that's like building mineral reserves and building energy storehouses really is like the rock or the earth. So that being my first love, I really recognized that was earth. And so that was how I figured that out. And as I said with the cordyceps, going through particularly strong personal shifts where, as I said, I sort of hit this moment where I was like, that's it, right? That's the energy of fire. And that's very much reflective of how a mushroom overtakes the body of like a living caterpillar and forms this like hybrid organism, as I said. But very similarly to the chaga mushroom, you can see it's kind of got a blackness to it. So chaga is a Jing herb. And actually, a lot of the time now, I'll put like Jing into like my Jing drinks. I'll add chaga, and while that doesn't allow it to be as yin, like what we were talking about before, it's still building that reserve. So if I'm having it during the day and I don't want to sleep and rest, and we can talk a little bit about that and some of the processes I did with that. But you can also see this has got a black club head as well. So it's black, right? And that blackness is a clue that it's Jing. Because one of the things that when we look to the night sky and the sort of the coalescence of energy from the universe, what we primarily see in the night sky, and even though most people answer stars, it's not that, it's a blackness. It's like this velvety blackness. And so that coalescence of energy from the outer universe finds itself manifest in the physical on Earth. And so when we look for black foods, and particularly black herbs, they have that Jing quality. But you can also see, even though this is old, right, but you can actually see oranges and yellows amongst the white with that. And that's very much a color, right, of the solar plexus, which is very much a fire element. So I sort of like recognized those two and went, okay, so I've got earth and fire. That's great. And as I said, I went through this really big kind of crucible of fire process around the cordyceps mushroom. And then after that, I very much moved to reishi, because finally we got what reishi was, because we were getting this incredible quality of it. And I went, oh my God, this is so calming and amazing. And especially for someone like myself, who for a long period of time, not now, but was like really strongly addicted to like the stimulating nature of cacao. Cacao, it sort of acts like a young Jing herb, but it's really not. It's a unidirectional herb that ultimately wears out your adrenals and taxes them. And it's funny because I worked out how to extend my cacao addiction, because I realized when I started putting adrenally supportive Jing herbs with the cacao, it sort of didn't wear me out as much. But it's a bit of it's a false promise, really. Like, the reality is it's more just you're having something good with something that's like fatiguing, and not trying to go at people who love cacao. I love cacao. It's great.
Well, a lot of people are kind of trying to do that with the coffee that's got various mushrooms and things added to it now, aren't they?
They are. And it's funny because we went through this whole period of time where, coffee is now a superfood. I mean, like, I've got to be honest and give my stance on it. It's not. It's still something that wears your adrenals out. And I do encourage coffee drinkers to incorporate mushrooms and tonic herbs that will sort of buffer the negative effects of coffee. But when you recognize that coffee is really just a stimulant that doesn't have anything really going for it, because the antioxidant reflection of coffee actually doesn't come from the bean itself. It comes from the fruit that surrounds the bean. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to like work more towards tonic herbs. Like, one of the things that I'm drinking at the moment, shameless self-promotion, is one of our lattes, because it's got ceremonial matcha in it. Now, I think, like, I found the way that, because I went through a coffee phase as well, so I was combining coffee and cacao. That's how I got really, really fatigued. But having things like matcha, it's a little bit like methadone at first, but if you get good quality matcha, it's giving that body nourishing energy. We all know about green tea and the qualities that it has. Yes, it still has caffeine in it, so it has got a stimulant, but it's still got like a whole bunch of things going on for it that are really good for the brain. And for that reason, there's lion's mane in there as well. But anyway, getting the elements, right, you can see with reishi that it's got these very curvy, feminine, beautiful lines. And when I turn it upside down, it's a little bit like a heart or a bird. So I really started to realize that soft kind of feminine aspect of it, that healing, nurturing, motherly nature of it, was very much reflective of the energy of water. So I was like, great, I've got 3 of them now. Fantastic. And I was at this meeting and we were talking about the mind, and because I'd watched Avatar and I understood that the element of air was to do with the mind, which is different to wind, by the way. Wind is not air. Wind is fire and air, right? Because in order to create that movement, right, you actually need another element. And that's getting into complex processes. But just so people are clear, wind is not air. When we think of the stillness of mind, when we're meditating or we're focusing, right, that's what air is. And that's exactly what lion's mane gives you. It builds up neurons. It prevents amyloid plaque, which is the thing that can cause neurodegeneration. And it causes the opposite of that. It causes neurogenesis. But what was interesting is that when I went to China, I experienced for myself, because I really didn't understand this phenomenon as to why lion's mane was outdoing reishi. As I said, I had my own biases, but clearly the mushrooms have had to baby step me through these processes and show me the value of each of these mushrooms and how they kind of coordinate to each other. Because lion's mane is like a standout. Like, it outsells everything. And the weird thing is that when I started Serendipity Superfoods, it was the last one. It was the last. No one wanted it. No one understood it. But now I think people like Aubrey Marcus, Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, all that sort of thing, really pushing lion's mane and that nootropic aspect. Nootropic basically means, for your listeners, something that works on enhancing the quality of your brain. And most nootropics that were utilized back in the days were more things like modafinil and paracetam and these chemicals that when we watch the movie Limitless, that sort of hyper color that you see, when he's on the pill was based off modafinil, right? Because when you have enough modafinil and you've been up for days, like, hustling, working, whatever it is, you actually start to see things in different color spectrums, apparently. I don't know. But like when you work with lion's mane, you're working with like a natural nootropic. And it's similar to matcha. Matcha is also nootropic because it contains L-threonine, which is like a particular amino acid that feeds the brain. But anyway, when I was in China, we had this like super rushed like visit to a farm, and I basically had to perform, and I'd only kind of just read through my notes like in the car on the way. So I was a bit worried about like doing my bit or whatever. But when I actually got to this farm, which literally had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these lion's mane, I could feel the energy of it like activating my brain. Just being in the presence of it, it was like my pineal started to sharpen and tingle. And when you look at a lion's mane, unfortunately I don't have one here, they kind of look like a little baby harp seal, like combined with a brain, and they've got all these little tendrils that come off it like a cascading waterfall, but very, very similar to the neurons, right, of the brain. You can kind of almost see them reaching out to connect with other things. And being in that presence of it, I felt, first of all, just really stimulated to be able to deliver what I needed to say, like with clarity and not missing a beat. There was only one thing I missed, which was the name of a scientist that I'd only read. So I remember saying, and Rita, so it seemed a bit weird and like offbeat. But the other thing I experienced, and I think this is the most profound part, is that white color is very much reflective of our crown chakra, right? That's the Shen. That's the flame that comes off the candle. And so lion's mane has this incredible ability to bestow a calmness and a Shen quality to you. And I really felt it, like being in the presence of that much lion's mane being grown by people who've been growing it for like 20 years plus, and they loved what they do. I could feel the energy of this lion's mane activating that Shen quality. Now, what's reflective of that is, as I said before about reishi, where particularly in China, you see it like in pictures, like giant reishis, like carved out of like metal and wood and everything. They hold it to like extremely high regard. The lion's mane in Japanese means, or the Japanese word for lion's mane is Yamabu Shiitake. And Yamabu Shiitake means those who sleep in mountains. And the Yamabushi are like these crazy meditative warriors that do things like meditate under waterfalls, or do like suffer extreme amounts of like pepper like in their eyes and breathing it in, and they've got to stay focused and meditate and stay calm and connected. And so they utilize lion's mane as like a sort of a part of that. And so it really made me go, okay, well, this is really keying into the whole idea of it being a Shen herb and being something that's meditative in nature. But going back to the reishi, it being something that looks very much like the heart, right? It calms the heart, and it calms the central nervous system. But if you imagine that for a minute, this is lion's mane, which it isn't, but like it's like when you combine these two, I started to propose that if you combine them together, you're actually creating a heart-mind connection. So you're moving those two elements of like water and air together, which kind of creates mist. So I mean, that's not necessarily what I was going for specifically, but I find that when you combine those two together, even just energetically, you're allowing your heart to speak to your mind and your mind to speak to your heart in a better coherence. That's the breakdown of those elements. I don't know if you want me to go into the other thing with the poisonous and all that sort of thing, but
we can get to that in a minute. There was a couple of things that I was going to say in relation to everything that you've been talking about. Just things that trigger little inspirational things or memories for me. But as you're talking about that concept of elements, we're talking about those. What might be referred to traditionally as the alchemical elements, earth, water, wind, fire, and ether, and of course there's the whole table of elements and the elements that we're talking about are not specifically that table of elements, but they're more the elements in a process of transformation. One thing going from one form to another, and the different states that it can be in. Say, like with liquid, water could be a liquid, a solid, or a gas, and so. There's different qualities or essences to each of those elements and the different states that they're in. Another thing that was coming to mind as you were talking about your relationship to those was that concept. I think it's called the law of signatures or something like that. The shape, various shape geometry of these plants. Has a correspondence with the various shape of organs or the brain or whatever it is in the body, and so you can basically detect what those things are going to be good for when you ingest them. You might have some more to say about that concept of the law of signatures, but one other thing that I wanted to say quickly was I can totally relate to that experience that you're having, as I'm sure many people can, of just coming into proximity of some of these products, whether it be out foraging or visiting these farms that you visited. The other day, when we were talking, I was sharing that experience that I have shared on a previous presentation about the relationship with the Morning Star and the Magic Mushroom and John Allegro's book that we'll get into, but. When I was in this sort of state of cosmic consciousness that you witnessed me in for several days, I was guided to go out of Melbourne to that area at Daylesford, and it was like I hadn't taken psychedelics previously, but it was like I was tripping on psilocybin for several days. I was just in this expanded, ecstatic state of consciousness, and it seemed like there was this larger consciousness directing all my movements, and it took me to what I would describe as a fairy ring, which was a sort of a ring of pine trees with all the Amanita muscaria, red and white mushroom at the bottom of it. And although I didn't ingest any of those, the frequency of it, my receptivity to it at the time, expanded me even more, and it was as though I was communing with that intelligence in the mushroom without needing to put it in my body.
Yeah, well, it's funny, man, because I too at that particular juncture was not had never done any sort of ceremonial psychedelics or anything like that. And if you remember rightly, I was loose as a goose as well. And, I mean, yeah, I can totally relate to that. Because there's been periods where I've been around amanitas and I actually like picking them. I don't take them. Right. I transform them, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later, when we get into the breakdown of the other elemental structures. But just being in their presence, yeah, they are like a gateway. In fact, a friend of mine actually proposed that each mushroom is potentially like an embodied alien kind of race. And so each different one is representative of some kind of alien race. And so they've got their own frequency. And being a wild mushroom hunter like I am, as much as some of them don't taste as good as others, I love going out and working with them in that way where you're walking through the bush and even just seeing them, the ones that you can't eat, like the one that I didn't really get a chance to see at nighttime, but you'd appreciate this being where you are, because I actually remember after that cyclone, I was fortunate enough to get to go to the Natural Arch, and there was a huge amount of fluorescent mushrooms. And I had to work for that too, because I'd actually driven all the way there. And I don't know if you know that there was a huge collapse in the road, which I actually, when I was up there last year, they'd only just fixed it. So that was a significant collapse. And I got there and I was like, I don't care, I'm going. All right. So I climbed over these telegraph poles that are and I'm like, I hope none of this is electrically live or whatever, and I had to go there, man. And it was phenomenal to basically be in almost like this avatar landscape where there's these incredible fluorescent mushrooms. But we have one down here, which is a much bigger one, but not as exciting. Like those ones are just popping. These ones are more ones that have like a glow, and that's Nidiformis omphalatus, which actually grows in pine trees and things like that. So like it's like when you resonate with each of these different mushrooms, you have a different relationship and lesson. Like one thing we didn't talk about last time, which I'd love to dive into, is my education with the truffle mushroom. I think you'll appreciate it because it involves the star tetrahedron, but we'll jump into that later. Sorry.
Yeah, you know, that those fluorescent ones that you're talking about, I remember a couple of years ago taking some San Pedro Rotuma cactus and in a ceremony for the day, and that's quite a long journey, you know. It was like a good 12 hours, and didn't leave that property. It was out at Wilson's Creek, and you know, didn't leave that property till like midnight. But in the sort of still expanded state that I was in my peripheral, I could see those fluorescent mushrooms, you know, and it was like being in a scene from Avatar, you know, that connection that you have to nature, you know, by ingesting those plants, or just becoming very sensitive to the natural environment that you're in.
Yeah, we should be clear. That's the blue Avatar.
Yeah, that's the movie Avatar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do we want to go? There's so many things, you know. I've got notes from you know, the talk that we engaged in the other day. But were you wanting to talk about, was it the toxicity or something that you were going to talk about a moment ago?
I mean, we might as well, seeing as we're sort of already talking about amanitas and you've already mentioned the star.
Yeah.
The other thing that I worked out while I was breaking down these elements was I had this deck of cards by Paul Stamets, and each of the suits was kind of made up of these 4 different types of mushrooms, and I kind of created this overlay with the earth, air, fire, water, with each of these different groups. So those groups are basically like gourmet mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, poisonous mushrooms, and psychoactive mushrooms. And what I recognized is they each fit into like a very clear box in terms of their elemental relationship as well. So, for example, the medicinal mushrooms, even though this is earth, it's still water, right? It's still healing in its nature. It's very medicinal. You need to cook it up. You can't, you know, just take a bite out of it. Even if you cooked it, it's something that you need to leach the energy out of. You can't just eat it. And it's the same really thing with the reishi, and probably ultimately what I discovered with the cordyceps, given the fact that eating raw cordyceps makes you have a horrible shamanic experience. But so the gourmet mushrooms that we associate, you kind of think of things like, you know, a Tolkien world where, you know, you get invited into a hut and there's like a hobbit or something like that, and they've got this big pot on the stove, and you can smell that rich earthy scent, and you're in like a stone or a, you know, an earthenware kind of dwelling. And so you can really see that association to being earth in nature. So when I think about the gourmet mushrooms that I go out and harvest and things like that, to be fair, while I'm sure they do have some medicinal properties, they're not on par with like reishi and chaga and lion's mane and cordyceps and miyataki and turkey tail and agaricus blazei and any of those sort of ones. They're more something that you would have as a gourmet, and sort of just enjoy that nourishing aspect and get the protein and all that sort of thing. So I put that into that bracket. And then I after my dieta, I actually went up to pick my son up from Horsham, where he lives, and his mother's quite psychic, and she didn't really, I don't think she knew specifically that I had done this dieta, but that energy would have very much been radiating from my field, because I learnt a lot in those 2 weeks around mushrooms, from self-reflection and whatever. And we were talking about this particular outlaying of the deck that I discovered, and she picked up one of these cards and said, when people consume this, it's not a death like you think it is. And it's interesting because that's very much reflected. There's a video you can see online of, I can't remember his name, it might be Starhawk or something, but you can see this guy consuming a raw Amanita phalloides, which is known as the death cap. And you can see he's like transmuting his energy as he eats it because he's preparing to do ceremony. And I do not suggest that anyone does this, because an Amanita phalloides involves, first of all, a 24-hour period where you feel like you've got the most violent, horrible flu ever, where you're vomiting your guts up, and then you feel like you're getting better and you just think that maybe you ate a dodgy curry or something, right? But then what happens over the course of the next week is that other aspects of this mushroom start to shut down, right? Your liver, your kidneys, your brain, and ultimately kill you. So the fact that this guy's managed to do that very much is reflective of what my son's mother was suggesting, which is that you can transmute these mushrooms, but in most cases, say in the case of the Buddha, or Siddhartha, whatever, right, who knew that his last meal was a poisonous mushroom, but according to the laws he'd created, he had to accept the meal that was given to him. And, you know, his followers knew that he was eating a poisonous mushroom, so he actually died eating this poisonous mushroom. Now, whether that's an allegory or not, it just shows that this huge transformation can go on. And so, again, like the cordyceps, anything that has a dramatic transformation, it's the energy of fire. So poisonous mushrooms are fire. And when we think of poison, we think of fire. So I kind of identified those two, and that was great. Then I sort of thought about the medicinal mushrooms, and that was obviously very watery and healing and things like that. And then the final one was the psychoactive mushroom. And when we think about its ability to rearrange the neurochemistry of the brain, it's very much that air element. But what was interesting, and I kind of discovered this later on down the track, is taking cordyceps in its raw state, it's fire, but it's also water. So what's going to calm down that fire is water. So if you actually boil this, you're getting the qualities of the mushroom that you want to build that Jing and Qi, to open up your lungs and do all that sort of thing. So it's that difference of having it as fire native to basically converting it into water. So it's fire of water, whereas this is water of water, and this is like air, earth of water. And so in theory, there's probably a way, again, not suggesting this, to somehow transmute the energy, whether through some sort of internal alchemy or physical alchemy, where you could transmute the Amanita phalloides death cap into something that was actually safe and manageable for your system, so you could experience whatever benefits they had. And then you've got the wild card, which you sort of brought up before, which is the Amanita muscaria, and I have quite a lot of these, so I'll take one out so you guys can see it. So they're like the red and white spotted mushroom, or the fly agaric mushroom, also known as the toadstool. That's what they look like once all those like dots have come off, which they come off very easily in the. And this mushroom's interesting because it fits into all four categories, and it took a number of years for me to work out how. Obviously, it's a psychoactive mushroom, sort of. It's also a poisonous mushroom because it contains certain neurotoxins within the structure of it. But all of those are water soluble, which is totally different to the psilocybin, which I'll get to in a minute. So I was like, all right, so you can turn it from a poisonous mushroom, a psychoactive mushroom, into a gourmet mushroom by bleeding out the toxins in water, and then you can eat this mushroom. So it covers all three bases. And so for a number of years, I couldn't work out how it would actually fit that final piece, which I knew it would. And I came upon this blog where this woman was talking about in areas where it's actually native to, because remember, it's not actually native to Australia, it's come over with the pine trees. And so when you consume a small amount of it, like a tablespoon of it, and you cook it up in like scrambled eggs or whatever it is you want to eat, it kind of has a little heating and sort of energizing quality to the body, so it becomes tonic in nature. and not to confuse tonic with adaptogen, but like it basically has like somewhat of a medicinal benefit, right, if you take sort of small doses. And what's funny is that because the climate it comes from is so cold, right, people would obviously consume large amounts of it, and that's when it becomes an inebriant and ultimately something that kind of makes you go a little bit mad. And you can see that reflected in things like Alice in Wonderland, and other things in fairy tales. But it's interesting because it's so reflective in fairy tale myth and shamanic myth. It's almost like this, it sits in the middle of the wheel between earth and air and fire and water. And its counterpoint to that is psilocybin, which is, coming back to this, right, how I recognized a lesson I learned about blue and red. So the divine masculine is blue in nature, and we kind of give that to little boys as sort of their native color to wear, and we give girls pink. Well, how does that relate to red? Because red is actually natively the color of of the divine feminine. Well, in secret women's circles, they'll tell you that one of the ovaries is actually red and one of the ovaries is actually white. When we combine the red and the white together, we get pink. So we can see that a woman who is like not fully formed and is in that girlish state is going to be natively reflecting that energy of pink. But when you have a woman who's reached adulthood and is starting like their cycles and things like that, we think of like the sexy woman in the red dress. So red is very much that native color of the feminine. Now, Amanita muscaria is basically primarily red in nature, but it's also got white dots on it. So it's kind of like a hint to the feminine anyway. As an inebriant or a psychoactive, if that's even the right term, it's a deliriant, right? And this is one of the reasons a lot of people don't take it, because it has a very unstable effect and it differs from person to person. So some people can get very, very sick on it and nauseous and, projectile vomit. Other people have the best time ever, and it's very much reflective in that sort of Siberian folklore to do with Santa Claus, and taking the Amanita muscaria on the shortest day of the year, at the winter solstice or Yule. So it being an inebriant, right, we can see it reflected in like the Jefferson Aeroplane song, which talks about Alice taking something and basically growing 10 feet tall. A lot of people report on the Amanita muscaria, right, that they'll go outside and grass will actually be taller than themselves. So it actually bends reality and shapes it in a way that's so distorted that's very much reflective of the magnetic nature of the feminine. And we can see that in the misunderstanding of women from men going, why did you do that? That's just crazy. Right? Well, it's all about emotionality, and it's about that that aspect where it doesn't necessarily make sense. Whereas when we look at psilocybin, the only other active mushroom that does, change brain chemistry and is psychoactive in nature, it's kind of identified by the blue coloring of the stem, which it stains when you bruise it, or in some cases it just literally has that blue to it. And so that's very much reflective of the masculine nature of psilocybin to like restructure the brain. And hence, like why I was saying before, that psilocybin is very much air in nature. But really, the master mushroom is still Amanita muscaria, because it sits in the middle of the center of that wheel, because it covers all bases. And it's interesting that psilocybin, when you get a whole bunch of it and put it in water, if you drink that water, it's the same as if you consume that mushroom. So it's kind of stable. Right, which is very much the masculine as well. It's that stable energy, and it's kind of bitter in nature too, which is also reflective of the masculine. Whereas the Amanita, very much like the Phallodes actually, is apparently Amanita Phallodes tastes sweet. It tastes like candy, which is where a lot of people have gotten poisoned and died from consuming the Phallodes. And when you consume Amanita, it tastes like candy. I have taken micro doses of it to like work with it. So what I started to propose is that there's a divine marriage between these two mushrooms, and that for those who want to explore that, combining those two mushrooms as a consumptive will actually connect the left and the right hemisphere up, the masculine and the feminine, and actually kind of bridge the missing elements from each of them. and I do have some people who've worked with it in that fashion, and they've reflected to me that it does have value in that particular connective.
Yeah, just as you're talking about that, I know my buddy Ray, who established Happy High Herbs. They used to sell them in the Happy High Herbs shops, and they'd sell them under the title of a dream pillow. And in the same way that we were talking about being in the presence of some of these mushrooms or different plant spirits and whatnot before, and them having an effect on you, putting them under your pillow when you sleep at night can really influence your dreaming. And I think I mentioned to you the other day, I decided to ingest some of them one time on Christmas, because I knew of the mythology of taking them on that solstice. And it was quite an interesting Christmas, because two of my friends decided to drink my piss, knowing that the once they've filtered through the kidneys, that they have a psychoactive effect. They didn't experience too much, but it was amusing for me, and will continue to be for many years afterwards. But going off on a tangent there.
Well, no, can I add that, actually?
Yeah, go for it, bro.
Because when I was living with the Hare Krishnas, I wasn't a Hare Krishna, but I just ended up there. I hung up with some strange people, and I did adopt the process of Shivambu for about a year or 2 years, which is pretty much drinking your own urine or urine therapy. And I had a really bad experience on psilocybin, actually, because I took it in anger. And I had it wasn't like what you would consider to be a hectic trip or anything like that, but it was certainly not fun. And because of what I'd learnt before from, actually, Janardhan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Janardhan actually used to live with the Haris. So I knew Janardhan years and years ago. And he once went out into the forest, and he just kept doing Shivambu, and it refined the experience of the psilocybin more and more and more over the course of a number of days. But what I found is that after that bad experience, what it did is that it refined it so that I could kind of bring myself back to center, and I could really feel that. And probably that's because of the fact that I was already solidly practicing Shivambu anyway, which is pretty much like a homeopathic reimbursement of the system. Like they say that if you get bitten by a snake, that Shivambu will actually give you the homeopathic remedy for that. Not that I'm about to put my arm out to be bitten by a snake and try that. But it was very different to alcohol, because there was actually an old cure, where a young woman who couldn't sleep would actually drink the piss of a young male. It was very specific, but it doesn't tend to refine the alcohol, but for whatever reason, with the mushroom, it does. It refines it. So it's very much reflective of what your friends decided to do.
Yeah. You were sort of touching on that, when you're talking about the Amanita muscaria as a sort of a deliriant, and of course the use of psilocybin for activating those psychedelic states. I've been reading this amazing book. I did a little presentation on part of it the other day, called The Shaman's Doorway by Stephen Lanson, and it's all about the mythic imagination and the mythic realm, which we might also refer to as the psychedelic realm. And amazing book. But a lot of these, the use of these psychedelic plant medicines seem to activate our awareness of that mythic realm. And you were touching before, you mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation about your business partner, Dan, having a visitation by the cordyceps man, and the other day we were talking about this, I mentioned Carlos Castaneda's encounter with a green man that was mescalito, the spirit of mescaline, or the cactus. And this is a very common experience for people to have, is encountering these sort of anthropomorphized versions of the spirit of these plants, and being taught by them in that sort of mythic realm.
Yeah, absolutely, man. For sure. I also think though, the reasons that all the things that happen to mushroom people are very much kind of part of initiations and things like that. And 2015, when all that went down, was like, man, we had crazy rains. It was amazing. And I called it my gap year actually because I never really got to have a gap year, and I just had the best time. I spent so much time mushroom hunting, which really galvanized the building of like what would ultimately become a number of years of like working almost 24/7 on Teelixer, and there was very little break. Even though I live out in nature, or I lived in a country town, I didn't see nature at all. So that when I did, it was like it fed me, because I was mostly living in this like ex-police station and just hustling, really. But yeah, I do. I think that because it's funny, man. Like the one and only time that I actually did a ceremony for someone, which I think you know as well, but I probably shouldn't name names anyway. But it was weird because I took a micro to like run it, and not very much happened. But weirdly enough, the truffle, I don't know whether I would call it the truffle spirit, but because when you have a micro, it's much more subtle. But it was like the truffle spoke to me, and I was like, "That's weird. What's that all about?" Because like I was interested in all sorts of mushrooms, but I went through a 3-year process with the truffles. All right, truffles are a really, really profound mushroom. And it's funny because I know that you played with, I think, Philosopher's Stone as a truffle.
Yeah.
And I would say that the psilocybin, or the particular resonance of the psilocybin in that, I would propose would be more shadow aspect versus the, not that there's not a lot of shadow aspect in psilocybin, but I would say that something that's below the ground is going to have a lot more shadow work in it, particularly if it's a psilocybin. I don't know if that reflects what you experienced.
Well, it's just something that is interesting to throw around just for debate's sake. I was going to ask you a question, about the relationship of these fungi and mycelium to light, and obviously, there's a metaphor there. Truffles are grown under the ground, and what we see in guild mushrooms or these wood mushrooms are really the fruiting body of what's underneath the earth, isn't it? Is that correct?
Look, I might as well go into the truffle story, really, because truffles is like one of the most interesting mushrooms I've ever worked with, even though last year was kind of like my passage away from the truffles. But there was actually like 3 years, or I mean, you could call it 4. In 2015, I bought a truffle from Terra Madre, which is like just it's an organic shop in Melbourne. And I wanted to infuse it into honey. I wanted to make truffle honey. And there's a particular relationship with mushrooms and honey, which Paul Stamets has identified, but also for anyone who's delved into the psychoactive realm knows that you can infuse psychoactive mushrooms into honey. And there's actually a cave painting in Algiers, which depicts like kind of a man with the face of a bee, and he's got like mushrooms for hands. So it shows this harmony between mushrooms and bees. What are you doing?
I've just got to turn my computer charger on.
Okay, I better do. You know what? I'm going to do that too.
I thought I plugged it in before we started, but here it is.
I thought I had it.
All right. Well prepared as always. Can you hear me, bro? Because another of the topics that we touched on the other day, was the concept that you were talking about.
Before we start, I might as well quickly run to the toilet then.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just rant. Jules was explaining the other day the concept that he had around mycelium, the relationship of them being a sort of a form of the Earth's internet or artificial intelligence, and yeah, we'll get into that in a sec. Are you back?
I am back. I really want to go through this truffle story, man, because I think we're going to. This is super amazing. So anyway, the first year I basically got this truffle, which I later worked out is known as an enclave truffle, which basically means that the truffle's been cooked and it doesn't have any aromatics to it. And not much happened as a result of that, but I had this truffle in a jar of honey and I carried it with, and I had a label saying the date and all that sort of thing. And everyone thought it tasted great. And I was quite good at picking honeys anyway, as I know you would have had my Shagalaga Ding on. That's a very special honey to make that. You can't make it with any old honey. Anyway, in 2016, I inadvertently ended up at a farmer's market in Melbourne. And it's weird, man, because like when we were hanging out and we were going to farmers markets, the thing that I ignored more than anything was mushrooms, right? Because you couldn't eat those as a raw fooder. I mean, I think I tried once or twice, but just to be clear, you cannot eat raw mushrooms. They need to be cooked because of the way they're structured, right? So they're actually structured out of chitin. So you need to actually heat them or extract them in order to eat them. Otherwise, they're useless to the body, or in the case of the cordyceps, they can make you quite sick. Anyway, so I'd seen truffles at market, and I was like, I'm not paying like $50 for like this tiny little thing. It's like, I'd rather go and buy celery or fruit or whatever. But anyway, now that the passage of time had passed, I ended up back at the farmer's market, probably with the same seller. And I was ready, and he showed me this truffle, and I was super excited because anything to do with mushrooms excited me. And I think I was reading a book called Mycophilia at the time. And so and again, this does get into the star tetrahedron, but it took me 2 years to figure it out. So the first year I started to make what's called abundance honey. So I would actually get these truffles and I would grate them up and put them into the honey. And the reason I kind of saw that the energy of truffles was to do with abundance is it's one of those things that rich people have. You know, they might go out and they get lobster mornay or they get caviar. Well, in truffle season, they go out and they basically, have these dishes that have truffles in it. But as I was to learn 2 years on, most of the truffles, sadly to say, are either not real truffles, they're not ripe truffles, or they're truffles that are dead, or in the worst case, like what I'd actually bought in 2015, they were enclave, which means they'd been cooked and destroyed. The power of the truffle comes from its aromatics. So for people who know what umami is, right, umami is like something that the Japanese identify as a particular flavor. The genius of the truffle is it contains all umamis. Right? I can't remember all of them, but I know one of them is glutamic acid, which we see mimicked in the horrible additive in most foods to make things taste better, which is called MSG, right, or monosodium glutamate. But glutamic acid in its natural form, especially when you combine it with salt, it makes the taste bud just pop. And there's definitely different levels of like truffle aficionadory. And I, in the second year, basically met the king of those. So in 2016, as I was making this abundance honey, which I was giving out to people and stuff, and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. I was like actually doing it completely wrong. Because truffle honey is actually a myth, but I'll go into that because I really want to get more into the esoteric nature of it. So I identified what would be the first point of this tetrahedron. It's not a full 3D tetrahedron, by the way. It's just a 6-pointed one. So really it's more of a Star of David. Anyway, so in this second year, I went back to the guy who had been buying truffles from on like a semi-regular basis because they're quite expensive. So I was really only experimenting, putting them into ghee and putting them into honey. I tried it with coconut oil. It doesn't work. Truffles have this incredible affinity for death, which makes sense to do with the shadow. So things like meats and dairy, and for some reason honey, and salt, that's the affinity of the truffle. But in this second year, I went through this huge process where I went and saw my original guy. I wanted to show him my truffle honey and my truffle salt. And he's like, yeah, that's pretty good. But I'd wanted to visit this guy, Stuart, who's actually out in the Yarra Valley, because there was this rumor that the largest black Périgold truffle, which is the black winter truffle of France, and considered to be the best, even though people will tell you Italian truffles are better, they're not. It's just that they kind of found them first. And I won't go into the history and lore of truffles too much because that's way too long. But anyway, I drove out to this guy's property, and there was no one there, which I was like expecting like people to be lined up to get truffles. So I spent quite a long time talking to him. But I showed him the truffle honey and he went, meh. And I showed him the truffle salt and he goes, nah, smells like yeast. And I was like, master. I realized that this guy had the nose and the finesse of understanding truffles. So he also showed me the largest Périgold truffle that's ever been grown in the world. So it was true. It wasn't a rumor. The fact that I'd followed my nose. And interestingly enough, this farm is like within 5 kilometers of my warehouse. So I kind of associate with the cordyceps and the truffle as being like the main mushrooms that are kind of emblematic of my company, at least at this stage. Anyway, I realized that for something that should be abundant, this guy was not abundant. He'd been running a truffle farm for 14 years. And I was like, this doesn't really make sense to me. Like, how is it that you're not abundant? Like, the energy of truffles is abundance. And it was over the course of that year that I identified that there was a shadow aspect to that, which was basically the next point of the star, which was lack. And so as much as you can utilize truffles to basically create abundance in your life, the flip of that, the shadow aspect of that, is very much one of lack. Then the other aspect, and this gets into, for those who go out and buy truffle oil or truffle flavored chips or pretty much truffle anything, sadly, it's not real truffles, and Stuart showed me what they use. And when you smell the actual chemical they use in its raw form, it smells rank and toxic. But when you use a small amount of it, you can put it into olive oils. And unlike the truffle, which is very fleeting in nature, very, very fleeting. So they only last a couple of weeks. They sweat immediately and start to lose mass. You've got to baby them. You've got to be really, really careful with them or they get mold. And really, they've only got a 2-week window before they basically start to die down. So I started to realize that a lot of the truffles on the market were false. And so there's this imposter energy with truffles. And what was interesting is here's a guy who was selling me truffles who was in lack, but he had the opposite of that. He was always complaining and talking about the Western Australian truffle people who got woofers to pick their truffles and all that sort of thing. And so, because they would use dogs or pigs to actually find the truffles, you need that. But the dogs or pigs would find the truffles at a certain kind of level of the truffle's ripeness, so that the farmer would then mark them and then come back a week later or whatever. And in WA, they've got huge properties and they just get people who aren't trained to pick these truffles out of the ground because they're marked. But the reality is they're not ripe. And so the truffle industry is rife with overcharging, but also this imposter nature. But what I saw in Stuart was the opposite of that. And I realized that he had incredible integrity at the opposite of that. He was experiencing lack and not making money, but he had this incredible integrity. So I started to identify that. And as I said before, truffles are fleeting in nature. And this feeds into actually how I ultimately developed the Reishi Rose cacao formula, or mushroom cacao latte, whatever, which is related to the movie Perfume, and how there's like a head and a midsection and a tail section of the perfume itself. But so this fleeting nature, the opposite of that is grasping. And the way that I describe that is basically like Gollum. Remember when, not Gollum. Remember when Frodo meets up with Bilbo, and Bilbo sees the ring around Frodo's neck, and he sort of turns into this like Gollum creature as he reaches for it as a last-ditch effort before pulling himself back. That's very much a physical expression of the negative aspect of grasping. See, we think of fleeting as being a negative energy. It's not, right? When we understand that things come and they go, and we can actually allow and understand cycles of nature, we can allow them to be, be good. But the opposite of that is a grasping nature. Now, what was interesting is what happened next. While I was writing this tetrahedron, I was sitting in a class of Sharons, and we were asked to bring something to offer to the altar or whatever. And I was, told whatever to bring a whole bunch of my truffle honey. So I just basically piled it around the altar. And I think you'll find this fun, Carl, because this is how I worked out the tetrahedron. Directly above the altar was a geometry that would have had to have been from Bali. There was a star tetrahedron directly above it. So I wasn't really paying attention to the class because I found it quite difficult at that time to understand it. And so I started drawing this tetrahedron and writing up these 3 positive points and 3 shadow aspects of it. So to clarify, like the top ones are basically abundance, fleeting, and integrity. And the bottom ones are lack, grasping, and imposter. A week later, in my company, a member of my company who definitely helped me along for a certain period of time, but it was weird how like he'd been kind of avoiding emails and avoiding like certain work commitments that were required. It all blew up, and basically you could see the monster kind of like rise out of the situation. And it was so interesting to see that imposter energy kind of like just turn up, right? As I was developing this. So there's a lot more to it because during that year I also made truffle vodkas and truffle alcohols, and obviously working with alcohol, it's spirituous, right? So that it has a different relationship. And I drank quite a bit of this truffle vodka, which is the most phenomenal vodka you'll ever have in your life. It's crazy because what it does. So let's say you get, with that whole idea of the umami, if you get a whiskey that's aged 10 years, if you put truffles in it, in the space of 3 days, you can age it another 10 or potentially like 20 years in its flavor notes. That's how incredible truffles are. But what I thought was interesting was on this esoteric level, I'd identified this particular Star of David or tetrahedron to do with the truffles. And it was funny because last year, I really didn't buy that many truffles. Like I made some truffle butter, which I went into this kind of vegan phase, so I didn't really eat much of it. I made like 1 or 2 bottles of alcohol, and my son broke one of them, and I could just feel the energy leaving me. It's like I'd learned that lesson. And this is sort of how I've kind of learnt with mushrooms over a longer course of time. Last year was very much about the pine mushroom, which has got that orange quality. So it was very much about the sacral chakra and things like that, and healing aspects of that. And I mean, I was pretty much obsessed with the pine mushroom. I harvested a stupid amount. So every year there's kind of like a new fun thing, but for whatever reason, there had to be this 3-step process to the truffles in understanding them. And going back to the idea of it being a subterranean mushroom, it is the shadow aspect. And I've got this incredible book called Mushroom Essences. And when I opened it up and learnt about what truffle represents, it's very much to do with the shadow self. So it was very much reflective of what I'd kind of already keyed into.
Yeah.
So that's the truffle.
I know you're telling stories of your own transformation from experiencing the consciousness of these mushrooms. The other day you were talking to about the concept of mushrooms bestowing wisdom upon us, and I think some stories about sort of ancient, how in China they were kept for the emperor or something like that. And it certainly sounds like from these stories that the wisdom or the sort of initiations and processes that you're going through is that sort of experiential learning with these spirit medicines.
Absolutely, man. I think mushrooms have a great deal to teach us. 100%. Did you want me to go into that?
Oh, well, you could. And again, there's a couple of other things which were that we were talking about the other day. You know, you were giving us sort of an analogy of mushrooms being like the AI version or the internet of the earth, and again that concept that I was talking about the relation that they have with light. You know.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, it's interesting because mushrooms, the spore of a mushroom is the only thing that can survive entry into the Earth's atmosphere without being burnt up. So we know that mushrooms they have this ability to basically form new civilizations. And I know we touched on that. So it's interesting because a spore is shot out of the gill or the spore or like the pore of a mushroom at like significant speed. But the moment that it does, there's something levitational in that mushroom spore that ultimately makes it go towards the sun. And obviously not all mushroom spores do that, but we know that while we've got our terrestrial organization here, right, the mushrooms are continually seeding over the course of like millennia, right, other civilizations in far-flung reaches of our galaxy and other galaxies indeed, because what happens is that reaction with the ormus that's in the mushroom is that it will basically cause like a metallic structure, much like what we think of it as like an alien spacecraft. And so it sort of seals it so that it can basically survive the vacuum of space and re-enter through like a terrestrial atmosphere before it basically finds its route and then forms new civilizations. So yeah, it's definitely got an alien nature to it. And for those who've played around with mushrooms like psilocybin, they've probably experienced a lot of alien qualities to what the mushroom has to offer. In terms of like the AI versus OI, like we've created an internet structure on this planet that's AI, really. You know, like we're communicating through something that while it's feeding us and it's allowing us to like bridge the world and create all these new information channels, it's also draining us. Like we're sitting in front of blue light, we're sitting in front of TVs, we're plugged into mobile phones that are causing like disharmonic frequencies to go into us. So much in the same way as the electrical, wiring of the earth is not what Tesla wanted. The mushrooms are sort of like the organic principle of what is reflective in the internet. And Sharon, like the teacher I was talking about before, once said that the first thing to kind of rock up to a new civilization in its, formation phase is the elementals and the dragons. And the dragons are kind of like the world builders, and we can see the reason why dragons are used, all over the world, right, in different ways to represent ley lines or to represent royalty or to represent all these things that are about civilization and particularly building those civilizations. But the elementals, right, very much also involve the mushrooms. So the mushrooms are almost like the internet or the telephone wiring of the earth. And so I should go into what mycelium is, because I just realized we didn't touch on that, and I apologize. So when we think of mushrooms are really much like this reishi. It's like a fruiting body. So this reishi will actually pop out of a log, right, which it grows on. And beneath that surface of the log is the mycelium, which is this kind of like white matted, not really material, but that's the actual creature. The mushroom is just like the final stage before it reproduces in the form of spores. So the mycelium kind of is very hidden from view. And we don't really see it that often. And so if you can imagine that there's just literally tendrils all under the ground of a whole variety of different mushroom species that allows the communication for entire ecosystems, such as trees being able to communicate different mineral ratios and when storms are coming and all these sort of things, we can see that the complexity with the communication channels, it kind of dwarfs the internet that we've created. The internet is sort of almost like this surface veneer that we've utilized because we don't know how to yet work with the intelligence of the mycelium. And I think that as the years go by, we're going to learn better and better ways to work with it. and possibly change our internet to be more organic in nature rather than something that's deleterious to the current state of being that we're in.
Can you share that concept you were talking about the other day about things like the environment greening up and stuff prior to storms arriving?
About that, as I was saying it, I mean, it's really a theory because obviously some scientists say that it's the electrical fields in clouds that the trees react to, and they know to start greening up and reacting to the coming storm because they know that the right nutrients are coming in order for them to grow, so they start growing immediately. So what we see after a storm is basically that the earth is greener and the grass is greener and all that sort of thing. But it's also entirely possible that given that there's this vast causeway of communication channels going under the earth, that it's really the mycelium that transmits that information from tree to tree saying, I mean, for all we know, that it's not just like a tree that's 50 meters away, but a tree that could be 500 miles away that says, hey guys, there's a storm coming and basically start growing. So much that's unknown in the world of mycology. I mean, really, it's only kind of become a cool thing in the last, 5 to 10 years. Before that, if you decided you were going to become a mycologist, it probably wasn't the coolest branch of science. It's really people like Paul Stamets that have brought it to the forefront with things like these concepts. So we're really only just scratching the surface in terms of understanding, but that is entirely possible if that's the case.
Yeah, I remember the other day when we were talking about that concept, it made perfect sense to me because the environment, the ecosystem, it's just holistic. It's all functioning and working together. It's a living system that's sharing information and, on that as well, and that concept that we were talking about of like the mycelium being sort of like the Earth's internet, sharing all that information between trees and things, and it being below the Earth, sort of in the dark, and how we even in the internet that we have now, we have this concept of the dark web, where only a small percentage of what we actually see on our internet browsers when we open web pages and whatnot is, that's only a small percentage. The vast majority of it is in what they call the dark web, and that you have to be sort of a coder to be able to access the dark web. And it makes me, makes me think about the relationship that that the fungi and mycelium has to light, and certainly it was my second experience that I had with psilocybin after I'd accidentally taken some at a New Year's Eve party inside a huge mushroom house, which again, I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning, but Ray from Happy High Herbs, that was his house, is in the shape of a mushroom, and I accidentally took a bunch of mushrooms thinking that they were just some sort of herb, but I then found myself in this multi-dimensional high-speed landscape with access to vast amounts of information. And when I realized what I'd taken the next day, I went and got some more of them, but that night I remember going to bed and sort of falling asleep, but having these vivid dreams and seeing geometry, that being able to perceive it in my mind in a way that I'd never sort of been able to perceive before, where everything was just toroidling through itself, and it was all paradox, that there was no separation between the inside and the outside, and next to every problem there was the solution, and totally vastly changed my perceptions of everything from that point. And in that next experience that I had in a day or two afterwards, I remember, it was like the psilocybin, when I ingested it, it's like it took over my central nervous system, and my individual consciousness interfaced with that mushroom consciousness, and it's like the mushrooms wanting to have an experience of being human. And it was fascinated with the internet, and I was posting, I think I posted some things on Facebook about tripping on mushrooms, and immediately everyone's sending me, those GIFs and things that look two-dimensional, but when you're tripping, they look completely multi-dimensional, like you could put your hand through the screen. But they were also sending me some of, I think it was writings by Terence McKenna that were talking about the nature of the consciousness of the mushrooms being interstellar, and how they sort of tap you into that interstellar connection again. And in the same way that, they seem to be a internet of the earth, there also seems to be this mycelium of light that connects us through the cosmos, that the mushrooms tap us into. They tap us into this high speed, multi-dimensional geometric structure of light, where information can be accessed at any point within the cosmos.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting. I remember after we did ceremony 10, like, it was weird. I was kind of like in this I'm slightly over this phase, and I remember a bunch of us, possibly you as well, I can't remember, but we all took like a micro, which shouldn't really do anything, but if you're sensitive, like what we talked about, like being naturally kind of able to have like these spontaneous and kind of endogenous experiences where it's just like, where did that even come from? I remember after ceremony 10, I would look at the stars, and much in the same way that you would see, oh, this is Capricorn, this is Cancer, like how they kind of knit all these stars together. All the stars seem to be three-dimensional, not as a single point. I'm short-sighted and I don't wear glasses, so I don't get the clarity that most people do. But it was like I could see the three-dimensional nature of the actual stars. And it's funny because in 2015, I remember having this experience, again, endogenously, where I was it was almost like the sun was coming down into me, and I was recognizing that it was like one causeway in a vast network of causeways that linked up various suns as like a geometry or a mycelium. I mean, we kind of immediately think like that there's going to be a direct causeway, so that it's like it's a straight line from one star to the other. But when we look at mycelium, it's obviously like curved in nature, and wants to suggest that those causeways are not curved, much in the way that probably a wormhole would be, and therefore it's also likely that maybe those suns are actually wormholes, who knows. But I mean, when we think of things on a universal level, logically, like each of those stars interlinking, knowing that there's like more stars in the universe than there are sand, like grains of sand on the earth, like, imagine like what that would look like if you condensed it and reduced it so that the space between the stars was less. It would probably look like a mycelium. And it's funny because I actually spoke to Juliet about this. I can't remember the bits of it, but I wanted to know what she thought of mushrooms. But I had this feeling that mycelium was really, really significant. And basically, the concept that for those who don't believe in God, it kind of reflects the eternal nature of God, not as a being or the things that we've been indoctrinated to, but really it's endless. And each of those node points of those mycelium is just a fractal aspect of God. And so that God can never actually coalesce into one being or one thing. It's just endless, right? And so therefore, you're responsible for, and I know I'm getting more into religious or spiritual talk here, but you're essentially responsible for yourself. So in other words, in some ways, here on Earth, we're one single node point of another as we connect with each other. And so in some ways, we are like a mycelium in and of itself on the Earth. But one thing I wanted to touch on with the light, when I was talking before about looking up to the night sky and seeing blackness, if we flip that and reverse that, what most people say is stars. So clearly there's something significant about those stars. And it's interesting because even when you close your eyes and you are having something like psilocybin, it's very much light driven. So even though that's only one aspect of it, and that's the psychoactive aspect of it, I think you're right, man. I think that that mushrooms and mycelium are very light driven, which is ironic because mushrooms live underneath the earth. So they're kind of what you're saying. They're actually more like the dark web, and it's like they're the light but without the light switched on, which is a difficult concept to kind of swallow. But yeah. Because, I mean, for years, man, I didn't consume mushrooms because, according to raw foodist movements, it wasn't a sun food, right? But I actually think it's the opposite. I think it is a sun food.
Yeah, oh, look, in that whole concept of what's dark and light, always makes me think about the tool that you're using to measure that, because, like if we look at the light spectrum, what we see with the visible realm of our eyes is a very small fraction of that light spectrum, so what we may perceive as darkness may well be filled with light as well, which tends to be the case when you ingest a bunch of psychedelics in the dark. But that concept that you're talking about, getting into the kind of spiritual element of it, and the concept of God, I guess brings us to that book by John Marco Allegro, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And
just before we jump to that,
yeah,
I want to say that, okay, yes, it's reflective of psychoactive mushrooms, but for example, when we were consuming vast amounts of cacao and then having that drink which contained reishi, and I'm not sure if that's specific to it, but I remember a number of times when I would go to bed and I could actually see this like purple light emanating out of my head, like it was clear as day. And I think that when we're in dark rooms, for anyone who's ever sat in front of a mirror in a dark room, you can start to see your face shift. And some people say that you're seeing your past lives, but that's also one of the ways you can develop psychic abilities or whatever, so you can see your auras. In the darkness is actually probably the greatest potential for light, because if we're surrounded by light on an everyday basis, we're not going to be able to see those subtle frequencies of light that our eyes can't pick up. We need the darkness in order to actually see that. So, yeah, I think we've solved it. I think we've proven it beyond reason.
Well, certainly that experience that I had that I was talking about earlier, where where I was in a state of cosmic consciousness, like being on psilocybin for several days. I have no doubt that the vast amounts of cacao that you were shoveling into me at the time had an active component in that experience, and on that subject, when it was, in the days after having that sort of peak experience, and all the synchronicities and whatnot that occurred for me, part of that ongoing was me telling you over the phone what had been happening to me for several days, and you saying to me, man, you have to read this book. And I was aware of that book through Robert Anton Wilson's writings about Amanita muscaria and his reference to John Mark Allegro's book. And then you said you had a copy of it, so I came over, and I wasn't allowed to take it out of the house because, that's the one, because it was sacred to your mother at the time. She didn't want me to leave the house, but I sat there typing up like the elements of it from different chapters that were of significance. And of course, when I opened it up randomly, as soon as you handed it to me, I opened it up randomly, and it was at this chapter that was the what was it? The mushroom and the morning star. And I was like, here we go. This is this connection to Venus and the mushrooms. Yes, star of the morning. There we go. And so what happened then, again, for anyone who's listening to this, who's interested in it, because of my relationship to the morning star, I was reading that chapter and realizing that there was this whole, I don't want to say mythology, it like, I guess, esoteric science or something to do with the relationship that the mushrooms had with the light of Venus, the light of the morning star, and how that star coming up before the sun in the morning would infuse the dew that was on the earth in the morning that would allow the mushrooms to grow. And it was like this sort of celestial semen that had been sprayed onto the earth. And then, of course, we had this incident with you coming down. I think it was you were reading David Wolf's book about chocolate, and you talking to me about the relationship that mushrooms and cacao had, psychedelic mushrooms and cacao, that oftentimes that cacao would be ingested because it had a relationship to the sun, and it would help to open the heart while you're in a psychedelic journey. And of course, you were brewing up some chocolate, and your mother had told us to take very good care of the book. And of course, you get me to taste this chocolate, and I stuck my finger in the chocolate, pulled it out, and it was like time dilated as a droplet of cacao flew off my finger as I was holding the book and hit the spine of the book. And of course, immediately your mother walked into the kitchen, and eyes like a hawk saw that we'd got chocolate on the spine of the book. And but interestingly, the very first page that chocolate hit was the page that was the star of the morning. So it was just another sort of weird synchronicity amongst all of this. What do you have to share about your memories from that experience too?
Well, I actually have the book here. Hopefully my mum never watches this video. I felt that to be clear, it wasn't that it was sacred to her. It's just that my mum comes from an era where everything is kind of, I don't know, whatever. But so I decided that it was mine, basically. So
it's always yours.
that is mine. I've never read it, which is interesting. But I love it because obviously my relationship to the Amanita muscaria. But you can actually see here, that's the actual chocolate stain.
Yeah.
And so that bit there is pretty much, that's how I could find the star of the morning so easily, because I just literally flick to the end of the chocolate stain, boom, it's there. And also, I think you're the only person who's ever read the book, actually, because like it's clearly like slightly bent so that you can read that bit. But yeah, it is interesting because chocolates and mushrooms do share a relationship, just as like mushrooms and honey do as well. There's certain things that like tend to kind of go together. So the glyph that means our sun, going back to talking about stars again, right, is basically a circle with a dot in it. And so that's in Western astrology. But what's interesting is it translates over to the combination of mushrooms and cacao in relation to like a Mayan or an Aztec context. So a circle with a dot basically for them represents the combination of mushrooms and cacao. And so I think, and it's funny because like chaga is actually considered one of the highest antioxidants on the planet, and cacao is also considered one of the highest antioxidants on the planet. One comes from a very tropical region, and the other one comes from an Arctic region. So it's almost like polarizing and forming together. I don't know, that's not specific to that, but in terms of when, like the very first time that I did a ceremony with active mushrooms, I was super nervous, and like we'd driven all the way out to the Otways. Like I felt really called to do it, but I felt super nervous. I didn't know what was going to happen because obviously, like yourself, I was so active so easily. Like there was just crazy things would happen without these things. So I had basically made this ridiculously strong chocolate pasty type goop or whatever, and all I ate that day was that. I was that much of a cacao addict. So I didn't eat anything but cacao that day, which I didn't realize was actually preparing me for quite a like extreme experience. It was clean and really good and quite galactic, and I saw this Egyptian stuff, and you know, it was like quite blissful and expansive and blah blah blah. And it felt like there were 5 layers of reality curling all around me all at the same time. It was insane. But I think that when you take something like chocolate, and there's probably a biochemistry to this where it relates to this, that when you combine it with mushrooms, it basically accelerates the intensity of that mushroom experience. And so we can see that very much relating to like psilocybin, but in terms of like the reishi rose cacao that I made, like combining reishi, which is a heart resonant herb, and cacao, which is a heart resonant, and rose that's a heart resonant, but it just seems that they go together so well. And it does seem that in the medicinal mushroom realm, it's more the reishis and the chagas, right? But I think that those mushrooms that share a more bitter element tend to work with cacao because it's so bitter in nature. So yeah, I mean, it seems to be reflected in its traditional culture. So there's definitely something to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's another thing just on that relationship with the mushroom. I know I've seen video footage of it and other people talking about this concept, and it's in Marco Allegro's book, but about the sort of alchemy of masculine and feminine in the mushroom. That it's like a penis going into a vagina, and that it sort of has this sacred alchemical union within the shape. I've seen mushrooms too. I remember getting some down in Melbourne that look exactly like penises. Like obviously they're good for that male energy, I would imagine, just based on the shape of them. I asked you this question the other day, bro, but I always again like to ask people that I'm interviewing. You gave me an answer to it the other day when we were talking about the concept of the three treasures, and in particular Shen and stuff. But I guess you've had a few days since we talked, and maybe something came to you in relation to the question or whatever we've been talking about today. But I always like to ask people about what the concept of the higher self is to them and how it informs the work that they bring into the world, and in this case your relation to mushrooms and to your business Teelixer. Is there anything that you want to share about that?
Yeah, let me think. I think well, for a start, all the things that I've kind of gone through today are reflective of that. Like, as much as these things don't translate over to the business world in its physicality, I think that the energetic things that I went through with the truffles and the energetic things I went through with each of these mushrooms and breaking them up elementally has definitely been the formation of my own kind of spiritual terrain. And I think because those ideas feel unique to me and have come kind of through natural progressions or ceremonial processes or whatever, and some of them have been fun and some of them have been really difficult and not fun. But like going back to the whole idea of Jing, Qi and Shen, because a lot of what we do and what we develop is very much centered around building like those three treasures. When you start to build your Jing, I actually listened to a podcast by Truth Calkins, and I learnt a specific formula to do with the Jing, which we're actually about to release very soon. And when you take a large dose of this, particularly with something like Pearl, it can actually put you to sleep during the day. And so that whole thing we were talking about, of going into a yin cycle and being reborn from that, the more you build your Jing, the more Qi you'll have, and the more you can express your spirit. If you don't have any Jing, if you don't have any energy, right, it's very difficult to express your spirit. But there's also an X factor beyond this where I think, how do I properly explain the unraveling of working with a mushroom like reishi, which is a spirit mushroom, and then choosing to take certain pathways like the work that I've been doing with Sharon and Joe for the last 5 years. Whoa. Like doing shamanic energy training, which is centered around Qigong, but like each and every time I go back and do that, there's another unfolding. So was this going to naturally happen, or is this related to the fact that I took reishi? Well, I think and this is an interesting thing with something like reishi. Yes, it's an anti-stress herb and you could feel amazing from it. Some people have this response where it's just like everything's all good, but it's also a saprophytic mushroom, which means that it kind of works on breaking down decayed material in its environment. And so by doing that and seeing that as a reflection within you, it's breaking down the decayed material of your spirit and ultimately releasing the shining light, like what we're talking about is a light. I mean, like actually, like another thing to touch on with light is like this. You can see this is shiny. That's that's not plastic. That's what reishi is. It's basically Ganoderma leucine. So it's a mushroom of light. So as decaying elements fall away, more of your spirit can be experienced. But in order to remove some of that decayed or rotting material, it can be challenging or painful or difficult or I just don't want to do it, that kind of thing. So in terms of how I see my higher self in relation to the mushrooms, I think they're intrinsic and they're bound. Like it's almost like I have this agreement to work with them and unfold with them over time in order to like understand more and more of my high spirit. But I definitely explore other things like the Qigong and meditation, and I think we're all here to learn and grow, and I think that we're all increasingly that we're continuing to learn and grow, and it's a never-ending cycle. So very much like reflected like the never-ending nature of the universe that's constantly expanding. If it is indeed a mycelium, well, it's very much reflective of the nature of like constantly growing, constantly learning, constantly expanding, and constantly being in beginner's mind.
Yeah, like I guess what's coming to mind for me as you talk about that is, you know, Joseph Campbell's concept of following your bliss, you know, and certainly like you have been inspiring to me over the years, purely through your enthusiasm and excitement about these topics, dude, you know, and you're clearly following your bliss in this relationship to mushrooms, and you know, thanks for thanks for inspiring me, and thanks for sharing what you've shared today and your experience and knowledge about mushrooms. I'm thinking probably on that point we probably should wrap it up. I know that we could talk for hours and hours about all of this. Can you tell people who are listening where they might be able to find you or your company?
Yeah. So my company is Teelixer, which is TEELIXIR, and you can find us at teelixer.com. And also we have stuff throughout Australia in various health food stores and not so much pharmacies, but some pharmacies, but mostly health food stores. But yeah, I mean, it's free shipping at the moment. So if you jump online, you can get anything. And if you have any questions, you can email us or call us.
Social media?
And there's also, what's that?
Social media?
Yeah, we have social media. Like we've got Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. So you can definitely connect with us with that. But yeah, there's also like some free online resources. We've got a number of blogs, which are very informative. And we've also got a book, which is basically, a really, really good introduction to mushrooms, because we didn't really go too much into like the specifics of each of these mushrooms, and that very much does that and has a bit about the history and folklore of the mushrooms as well. And it's a free ebook on our site.
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, this has been a good intro and rant and covered a bunch of different concepts. So maybe we'll do it again at some stage and get more into that type of information that's in the ebook. Yeah,
absolutely, man. Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool, bro. Well, thanks heaps. I'm going to hit the stop recording button. And for anyone who wants to find out more about any of these concepts, you can also check out futureselfdreaming.com. And peace, brother. Love your work.
Yeah, thanks, man.